Hey there. Ready to dive into You Are Not Your Brain?
Absolutely.
We're on a mission here, not just to summarize the book,
Right.
but to really extract those golden nuggets. Those things that can help you break free from those negative patterns.
Yeah,
Because we've all got them right.
absolutely. And what's so powerful about this book by Jeffrey Schwartz and Rebecca Gladding is that it offers a very specific, actionable four-step process for doing just that.
Okay.
It's not just theory. It's about rewiring those thought patterns that might be holding you back.
Okay, so let's set the scene. You've got this book. You're ready to tackle those negative thoughts.
Right.
And Schwartz and Gladding, they hit you right off the bat with this idea of deceptive brain messages.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, wait a minute, those voices in my head telling me I'm not good enough.
Right.
Those aren't even really me. Tell me more.
Right.
Yeah.
It's such a liberating concept, and they use this great analogy describing those thoughts as false foreign invaders
Okay.
trying to take over your mind. But here's the thing, and this is where the book gets really interesting.
Okay.
It's not about beating yourself up for having these thoughts.
Right.
It's about understanding that they stem from your brain's survival mechanisms.
So it's like our brains are still wired for a world where we're dodging saber-toothed tigers,
Yeah.
but now those danger signals are getting tripped by a stressful email or a traffic jam.
Exactly. Your brain's uh-oh center is stuck on high alert, even when there's no real threat. And that's where those uncomfortable feelings come from, the anxiety, the self-doubt, the anger.
Yeah.
And the book is full of stories of real people struggling with these exact things.
Right. Like maybe you totally relate to the person battling performance anxiety,
Yeah.
sweating through every presentation.
Yes.
Or someone who just can't seem to shake off that feeling of never being good enough no matter how hard they try.
And it's so easy to internalize those struggles, to think it's a personal failing.
Yeah.
But the book brilliantly connects those experiences back to our brain's wiring.
Okay.
It's not you, it's your biology.
Okay, that's a huge relief to hear. But if it's hardwired, how do we actually change it? That's where these 4 steps come in, right?
Exactly. They call it a solution, but I see it more like a mental toolkit.
Okay.
A set of practical techniques you can use to rewire those pesky brain circuits.
And it's not about willpower, which I appreciate because let's face it, that rarely works against those deeply ingrained patterns.
Absolutely. These steps work with your brain's natural processes to shift those patterns over time, and they're called relabel, reframe, refocus, and revalue.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So we've got our brains are stuck in overdrive, sending out these deceptive messages that lead to a whole lot of unhappiness.
Right.
But there's hope because we can rewire our brains using the 4 steps.
Yes.
But before we unpack those, I'm curious, how does this rewiring actually work?
Great question. The book dives into this fascinating interplay between 2 key parts of your brain,
Okay.
the self-referencing center and the assessment center.
Okay.
Think about a time you were super self-critical. That's your self-referencing center in overdrive.
Yeah.
It's constantly evaluating you. And if those deceptive messages are running the show, it can lead us down a rabbit hole of negativity.
Ouch, I've been down that rabbit hole a time or two. So how do we climb out?
That's where the 4 steps come in. They help us tap into the assessment center, which allows for a broader, more objective perspective. It helps you step back from those thoughts and ask, is this really true or is this thought helpful?
So instead of getting swept away by that inner critic, we can learn to pause, assess, and choose a different response. We become the CEO of our own minds.
Exactly. And the best part is this isn't just some feel-good philosophy. It's grounded in cutting-edge neuroscience.
Right.
The book talks about neuroplasticity, the brain's incredible ability to change throughout our lives based on our experiences, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
We've got a lot more to uncover. So stay with us as we dive into each of these transformative steps, starting with relabel.
All right, let's dive into the first step. Relabeling it sounds pretty straightforward, but I have a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're right. There's a subtle art to relabeling.
Okay.
It's about noticing those thoughts and urges without getting swept up in their drama. It's not about suppressing them or pretending they're not there, but rather acknowledging them with a detached curiosity.
So it's like, hey, anger,
Uh-huh.
I see you popping up again. Interesting.
Exactly.
Not, oh no, not anger again. I need to make you go away.
You're simply labeling the experience, anxiety, self-doubt, craving, just naming it for what it is. Think of it like being a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does simply labeling something change anything?
It creates a little space between you and the thought disrupting that automatic cycle of getting hooked. Remember that uh-oh center we talked about?
Yeah.
Relabeling helps you hit the pause button on that overreaction.
Okay.
Instead of getting caught in the story like this traffic is going to make me late and ruin my whole day, you notice, There's that anxiety again.
That's so cool. So it's not about suppressing thoughts, which I've always found impossible, but more about acknowledging them without getting swept away. That
Yeah.
feels way more doable.
Yeah.
It's
So is
a,
there any evidence that this actually works?
absolutely. The book talks about this amazing woman, Connie, who had a stroke and lost control of half of her body.
Wow.
And she used relabeling to help retrain her brain by consciously noticing every movement, every sensation.
Wow, if it can help someone retrain their brain after a stroke, it's got to be powerful. But she had to relearn how to move her body. Does that mean relabeling is something you have to practice? Exactly. It's like learning to play an instrument or speak a new language. The more you do it, the stronger this ability becomes. And the science backs this up. Studies at UCLA have shown that simply labeling emotions can reduce their intensity just by naming what you're feeling.
Yeah.
You're already calming those overactive circuits.
Mind blown. Okay, so we've labeled the thought or urge, created some space between us and the drama.
Yeah.
What's the next step in this rewiring process?
That brings us to step 2, reframing.
Okay.
This is where we start to challenge the validity of those deceptive messages to see if they hold up under scrutiny.
So it's like saying, hold on a minute, brain. Is this thought actually true, or are you just spinning a yarn here?
Precisely. And the book does a fantastic job of outlining common thinking errors that fuel these deceptive messages. You'll learn to spot them everywhere, like catastrophizing mind reading and those pesky should statements.
It's like learning a secret code. I'm already catching myself falling into those traps. So instead of just believing everything my brain throws at me, reframing helps me see those thoughts for what they are. Just thoughts, not necessarily truths.
Exactly. And this awareness is key because it allows you to shift from being a victim of your thoughts to becoming an active participant in shaping them. Remember Liz's story from the book?
Oh, yeah. I remember her anxiety was so bad, it was paralyzing her. But through reframing, didn't she start to see that her worry was actually making things worse?
Exactly. She was stuck in catastrophizing, assuming the worst case scenario every time.
Right.
Reframing helped her see that those anxious thoughts weren't protecting her, they were holding her back.
So it's about realizing those negative thought spirals often aren't based in reality. They're just our brains trying to protect us in a way that's no longer helpful.
Yeah.
But how do we actually shift out of that anxious thinking?
That's where reframing really shines. It helps us activate that assessment center we talked about earlier, allowing us to see the bigger picture instead of getting lost in the weeds of those anxious thoughts.
So instead of getting swept away by, what if I totally bomb this presentation and everyone thinks I'm incompetent, we could pause and say, okay, what's the likelihood of that actually happening? We're engaging a different part of our brains.
Exactly. And from that calmer, more rational place, we can make conscious choices about how we want to respond.
Yeah.
We're not just reacting to those deceptive messages anymore. We're choosing a different path.
Okay, I'm loving this. So we've relabeled those thoughts, created some distance, then we reframed our perspective, challenged those thinking errors. What happens next? Do we just sit there and hope for the best?
Not quite. This is where step 3 comes in refocus. It's about taking action.
All right, let's talk action. I'm all about doing something to shift those patterns, not just thinking about it.
You and me both refocusing is about consciously shifting your attention away from those negative circuits and towards a constructive activity.
So it's like saying to those negative thoughts, sorry, I'm busy right now. We're essentially starving them of the attention they need to survive.
I love that analogy. And the beauty of refocusing is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about finding what works for you. Some people find solace in mindful walking, others in engaging hobbies, still others in diving into work they find fulfilling.
Right, like in the book, Abby found that spending time with her friends helped her shift her focus away from her anxieties. And I remember reading about someone who loved to paint and found that getting lost in a creative project really quieted those negative thought loops.
Exactly. It's about finding those activities that nourish your soul and remind you of what truly matters.
So we're not just distracting ourselves, we're actively choosing to engage in things that make us feel good. It sounds like refocusing is about creating new, positive neural pathways in our brains rather than getting stuck in those old negative ones.
That's a great way to put it. And the book explains that strategically engaging activities, those that involve planning and decision-making, can actually help rewire our habit center more effectively.
So it's not just about zoning out in front of the TV. It's about actively engaging our minds in a way that promotes positive change. But I'm wondering what happens when those negative thoughts try to creep back in even when we're trying to refocus.
That's totally normal. It's like those thoughts have a life of their own sometimes.
Right.
But the book offers some helpful strategies for dealing with those intrusive thoughts, like taking a few deep breaths or acknowledging the thought without judgment.
So it's about having a plan for when those thoughts inevitably pop up, a way to gently guide ourselves back to that place of focus. It's like having a mental toolkit to navigate those tricky moments.
Exactly. And sometimes it might even mean adjusting your refocus activity to something more engaging or stimulating. The
Yeah.
key is to be flexible and experiment to find what works best for you.
It sounds like refocusing is an ongoing process of learning what helps us shift our attention and create those positive mental grooves. And I imagine that as we get better at relabeling and reframing, refocusing becomes a little easier.
Absolutely. The more we practice all four of these steps, the more naturally they'll become a part of how we navigate our inner world. We become less reactive to those deceptive brain messages and more empowered to choose thoughts and behaviors that are aligned with our values and goals.
This has been incredibly helpful. I'm already starting to see how these steps could make a real difference in my own life. But we've got one more step to go right, revalue.
You got a revalue is a powerful culmination of the first three steps. It's about recognizing the shift in your self-perception that happens as you consistently practice relabeling, reframing, and refocusing.
Okay, I'm ready to explore revalue and how it all comes together. Okay, we've talked about relabeling, reframing, and refocusing, learning to spot those deceptive brain messages, challenge them, and shift our attention.
Right.
Now, how does revaluing fit into all of this? It feels almost like a natural outcome of the first three steps, wouldn't you say?
You're absolutely right. Revaluing is about recognizing the shift in self-perception that happens as you practice those first three steps consistently. You start to see those deceptive brain messages for what they are, just thoughts, not truths.
So it's not about denying difficult feelings or pretending they don't exist. It's more about understanding where they're coming from. Like, hey, maybe that fear of failure I have is really connected to something from my childhood, not who I am at my core.
Exactly. Revaluing lets you detach from those old patterns and build a more compassionate and realistic view of yourself. You mentioned fear of failure. Remember Sarah's story from the
Little
book?
Sarah, yes.
Yeah.
She really resonated with me. But through revaluing, she started to see how those patterns were rooted in her childhood, how she had learned to tie her self-worth to her achievements.
Right. And once she saw that connection, she could start to untangle it. Sarah's story is a perfect illustration of how revaluing can lead to this incredible sense of liberation. It's about breaking free from limiting beliefs that aren't really serving you and stepping into your true self.
That's like taking off a mask you've been wearing for far too long and finally being able to breathe. But this idea of true self can feel kind of vague. How do we even know what that means? How do we tell the difference between what's truly us and what's just our deceptive brain messages talking?
That's where things get really interesting. The book makes this important distinction between true emotions and what they call emotional sensations.
Okay, so true emotions are those authentic feelings that come up in response to actual events in our lives, like feeling joyful when something good happens or feeling sad when we experience a loss.
Exactly. Those are real valid emotions, but emotional sensations, on the other hand, are more like those knee-jerk reactions, those habitual responses that stem from those old patterns and deceptive messages. They might feel very real in the moment, but they're often based on those outdated scripts we've been carrying around.
So feeling nervous before a big presentation might be a true emotion, but letting that nervousness spiral into, I'm going to mess this up and everyone will think I'm a fraud, that's probably an emotional sensation rooted in some old story I'm telling myself.
Exactly. And the more you practice the four steps, relabeling, reframing, refocusing, and revaluing, the more skilled you become at noticing the difference. You start to develop this internal compass that points you towards what truly matters to you, what aligns with your values.
It's about building that trust in ourselves,
Yeah.
that ability to navigate those tricky mental waters. And I love how the book talks about cultivating rational faith in ourselves as part of this revaluing process.
It's such a powerful concept, right? It's about recognizing your own progress, seeing how those old patterns have less and less power over you. As you continue to practice these steps, you start to see the evidence that change is possible, that you are capable of creating the life you want.
So to wrap up our deep dive into You Are Not Your Brain,
Yeah.
we've got these four powerful tools. We relabel those thoughts and urges, creating some breathing room between us and that mental chatter.
Right.
We reframe our perspective, questioning those deceptive messages and looking for those thinking errors. Then we refocus our attention on constructive activities, choosing to engage in things that nourish us and help us grow. And finally, we revalue our experience, recognizing the shift in self-perception that happens as we consistently practice these steps.
And remember, it's not about perfection, it's about progress. Start small, pick one step to focus on, be patient with yourself, and celebrate your wins along the way.
The authors leave us with this incredible question to ponder: how would your life be different if you truly believed you are not your brain? And I think that's what this whole book boils down to, the possibility that's available when we learn to take control of our minds and choose a different way of being.
It's not just self-help, it's a roadmap for real lasting change backed by science and full of hope. And that's something worth diving into.
Hey there.